Hello. I'm a bit annoyed at the moment. It'll wear off very quickly. I think I made the mistake of putting the radio on while eating my breakfast, and these economic people came on. There were two of them interviewed about the Spanish bailout. And to my mind, they didn't understand it at all. But then I don't normally have the radio on and have to listen to these people. Do they often let people on that don't seem to understand things? That was bad enough. But I thought, radio, what do we know? BBC Radio 4 should have it right, but you can't guarantee to get people. It was just obvious that they hadn't been learning about the bailout over the weekend. They'd been watching sport or something. They just went up to speed with what it was. I go to my Twitter feed, which I do like. If you follow on the Twitter solid people, you get good solid information. Cullen Roche at the bottom there. This is the opening snip. Time for all the negative Nancys to start saying how the Spain bailout doesn't matter. Now, unfortunately, this is not the first time that Cullen Roche has annoyed me over the last 3 or 4 months. I think he's starting to go more money manager as opposed to really trying to work out what's going on in the world. I don't blame him. He'll make more money like that. But time for all the negative Nancys to start saying how the Spain bailout doesn't matter. This is terrible, terrible thing to write in anywhere. But to bother to write that as a Twitter thing, it's sad to the point. It saddens me because he's been quite an inspiration over the last 4-5 years, Cullen Roche. But now I think he's a full-time money manager and just does things in a different way. Edward Harrison, same. I've followed for 4 or 5 years. Came just after Cullen Roche in the Twitter feed. Spain will need to think about this. What is Ireland's bank debt and what can be done about it? Follow the link, but it's a much more realistic way of looking at things. Carl Whelan, who's worth following as well, Irish, piece tells you that the bank debt in Ireland is hopelessly commingled with government debt. The Spanish bailout begins this process, and that's so important, and it just hasn't been brought up by people nearly enough, that there was a possibility maybe a week ago where they were talking about European banking, whatever it was meant to be, that might have taken the banking side was all going to go to a European thing, probably run by the ECB, and any problems with bank would go that way. But what happened on Friday stroke Saturday was that the Spanish government has basically gone in behind the Spanish banks, and that you can't stop that process now. So all subsequent bailouts of Spanish banking, and there will be many, will go via the Spanish government, and the Spanish government cannot afford it. The last one from Edward Harrison. Unfortunately, the Spanish bank deal is not a real Euro TARP. The sovereign is now truly on the hook for the future bank losses. And they're not looking, because the whole thing is just such an obvious political con that it's pathetic. So they think they're so good that they haven't even gone for bail-ins, they've gone for pure bailouts, or at least they think that's what they'll be able to get away with. The presentation of it is so obvious and political spin that it's just so easy to see through that this is what's frustrating me. The Spanish Prime Minister type goes, tell you what I'll do. Talk to these people in Europe. They'll understand that we can't be pushed around because we're big, we're Spain. We'll get what we'll call a credit line from them for 100 billion euro. And then, so we've got that, and I'm off to watch the footy. Later, we'll get stress tests done on the banks. They're already, the people are already there and doing them. It'll come in at nearer 50 billion. So the money will only be 50 billion on the Spanish government's books, not 100 billion. Hooray! How much better that is. And the Spanish banks are in so much better condition, they don't need the 100 billion, they only need the 50 billion. All faith is restored in the Spanish banking system and the Spanish government, and everything will be fine. So obviously the wonderful political spin, but so obviously cretinously crap when it comes to reality. And I have to turn to, Reuters, number 2, Stiglitz. European plan to lend money to Spain to heal some of its banks may not work because the government and the country's lenders will in effect be propping each other up, Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz said. Later in the article, with Spanish banks, including the Bank of Spain, the main buyers of new Spanish debt in 2011 and 12. According to a report by the Spanish Central Bank, the risk is that the government may have to ask for help from the same institutions that are now planning to help. The Spanish government borrows money off Europe, gives it to the banks and says, we've given you money now, you buy our debt. So the banks then get full of Spanish debt, and then they're just two drunks propping each other up. It's voodoo economics, Stiglitz said in an interview on Friday before this weekend's deal to help Spain and its banks was sealed. It's not going to work, it's not working, and it won't work. And number 3, New York Times, consciousness of a liberal. Paul Krugman ends his latest article. The question you should ask is, what problems does this solve, the bailout? It may put a temporary end to the doom loop of funds fleeing Spanish banks, forcing the banks to sell assets, driving asset prices down and creating further doubts about solvency. It won't help even here to the extent that fears involve euro breakup rather than default. But it does nothing to restore Spanish competitiveness or lessen the suffering from austerity. So the whole thing, at best, buys time, just like the ECB's lending programme from last fall. What will Europe do with that time? If past behaviour is any indication, the answer is nothing. It's bordering on fucking sad. I've thrown this in just to give you an idea. Don't worry your pretty little heads about it, but it's the EFS and the ESM. Where's the Spanish bailout money going to come from? To be decided. Where's the money going to come from? You're doing a deal, where's the money going to come from? Well, we'll sort that out later. Let's go and watch the footy. The EFSF is stopping. Now, all of these things have got horrendous complications about them. Whose debt will be superior and inferior and all sorts of things. It's very complicated. The EFSF basically was a guarantee program. This outfit in, I think it was Luxembourg, could just borrow money on the market, say, we'll borrow money because we've got the signatures of all these governments of Europe saying that if we don't pay back, they will pay back. Basically, that's how it was meant to be. That's the EFSF. The ESM is structured slightly differently. 5 lots of tranches. They call everything's a tranche now. 16 billion. 5 lots of 16 billion. The first 2 tranches making up 32 billion in second half of 2012. The second 2 tranches, 32 billion, sometime during 2013, and 16 billion sometime in 2014, making 32, 16, is that 80 or 90 billion? One of the two, can't do the math quick enough. 30, 60, 70, 80 billion. That gives them 500 billion to lend because they leverage it up. You've got that amount of capital, and so they'll borrow more money and say, well, we've got this solid amount of money in here that can pay you back. This is backing the borrowing that we're going to do. But it's not even cash, from what I can gather, and this is very hard information to find. It's not even cash. Something like the Portuguese government will put Portuguese bonds in there and say, well, that's our cash put up front. It's not cash at all. It's not actual cash. It's bloody parking tickets. But they don't care. They don't care at all. Right, GDP forecast number 5 for the world from The Economist, just to show there's just not enough oomph in the world for all this bailing out and borrowing. US and Japan doing really well at just about 2%. Blah. Germany and Britain hovering just above zero, with the Eurozone as a whole and the Europe area as a whole just below zero. It's pathetic. It's only pathetic. It's not their fault. I don't expect politicians to go and make growth. You can't. But they don't seem to understand that that is not nearly good enough to pay all these debts back. So they go bailing out with other borrowed money. Pop over to the United States of America and Binghamton, New York, which has an obesity rate of 37.6. CNBC doing the fattest cities in the United States, and Binghamton's number 2. 17,000 residents are obese. That's 37%, nearly 40% of them are obese. Meanwhile, 27.8% of Binghamton's population lives below the poverty level. I hope, because I'm going to be forced into diet changes, I don't go on about diet changes too much, but poverty leads to fatness because of the quality of food that poor people eat. What does it need? Education? I don't know. You tell me. Finish with market ticker Carl Denninger, who is consistently weird. Let's just face it, he's weird. But he loves his little facts and keeps these sort of charts bang up to date. As soon as the Z1 from the Fed comes out, hours later he's got his charts updated. Household at the bottom in red, as you can see, sliding ever so slightly down now. Non-financial business credit just about holding on. Financial instruments, all these fancy things that were selling around the world, that's the thing that's really gone down. Rest of the world, I've never known what that was. I should look into it one day. State and local government is just about holding its own, maybe increasing, and federal government is increasing enough to keep the overall debt for the United States just about increasing, and that's enough to keep the GDP at 2%, blah. But it must be noted that state and local and federal government, although the expenditure is up, their actual employing of people is down. You just got to ask yourself, how long can these things keep going on? Could be a song, that. Bye.